This will be a presentation and discussion with eco-socialist and labor organizer Jonathan Neale, who is author of the recently released book, Fight the Fire, Green New Deals and Global Climate Jobs. Next month, the latest round of UN-sponsored climate talks, COP26, will take place in Glasgow, Scotland. Some climate organizers call this the 26th Conference of Polluters, which I think indicates that the chances of substantial action from this are slim. Scientists say there is still time to avoid climate catastrophe, but it will require radical measures within the next decade. How can we build a movement that can win the changes that we need? And that's the central question for today. My name's Paul Fleckenstein. I live in Burlington, Vermont. I'm a member of the Tempest Collective, and I will be chairing today's meeting. Tempest, for those of you who don't know, is a membership collective that meets monthly for political discussions and organizing meetings. We have a number of organizing working groups and committees focused on different areas of work. We are bound together by a strategic outlook centered on the importance of struggle and working class organizations, broadly the politics of socialism from below. To learn more, you can visit us at tempestmag.org. In terms of you all, you are invited to introduce yourself in the chat, your name, where you're from, and if you want to give your preferred pronouns, you are invited to do that as well. And the last housekeeping things here, we have some solidarity guidelines that we would like to follow in these discussions. What we do is very important, and I realize it's also very challenging. So one is respect each other's contributions, knowledge, skills, and experiences. Appreciate each other's contributions, assume good intentions, approach disagreements as opportunities, and be present in the meetings. And by this point in history, everyone's got down the mute yourself and you're not talking and all the Zoom logistic stuff. So I don't need to go over any of that. The agenda for today, this will be an hour-and-a-half meeting. When I finish in a minute, I'll introduce Jonathan Neale, who will speak for about 30 minutes. We'll have 20 minutes of breakout groups with some questions for prompts. And then we'll have 25 minutes general discussion where we all come back together. So that puts us wrapping up at about 3:30 Eastern time, or about an hour and a half from now. Let's see. I think it's time to turn it over to Jonathan. Lee, are you on the call to keep time? Maybe not. Okay, well, Jonathan, I'll let you know at 15 minutes and when you have 5 minutes left. And now I'll turn this over to Jonathan Neale to kick us off. Welcome, Jonathan.
Thank you. And thank you very much, everybody, for inviting me. I'm going to talk to this book, and at some point, I'm going to tell you how to order it for free as a download or an ebook. But I'm also going to talk about socialists and climate change and climate jobs. And I want to start with why climate change matters, because I think there's a lot of confusion about this. And many of the arguments that happen, the political arguments happen, I think, because people think that climate change isn't really going to happen. It's really going to happen on a serious scale. The UN has been saying that we should keep below 1.2 degrees. The chances of that happening are almost nothing. Given the amount of time it's taking us to build the necessary global mass movement, I think it's really quite unlikely that we'll get under 2 degrees. The question is, what happens when we get much more than 2 degrees? At some point, I explain the details of the science in the book. But at some point, we're going to hit the point. We're going to hit the point where many different feedbacks that increase the speed of climate change are all reinforcing each other. We're going to hit the point where we have a cascade of feedbacks, and therefore we have a cascade of natural disasters that become social catastrophes. So instead of one catastrophe in one place, you have many in each place and many different places. At that point, it will be increasingly difficult for human beings to cope. And I want to say a bit about what that will mean. First, let's start with the effects. The physical effects of rising temperature are, first of all, and perhaps the most important of all, is drought and a change in rainfall patterns. So that rainfall falls very fast, very hard, so it's not absorbed by the soil. It happens at the wrong time of year for the crops that are usually grown. So again, it's useless because it's falling so fast. When it does come, it creates floods that wash away the soil, and and there's not enough rainfall. All of those things leading to not enough crops, which in bad years in many, many places already means serious drought. It will mean serious famine, which we've seen in some places. And it will mean famine in the good years and something awful in the bad years. The second effect, which is beginning to be important in quite a few places, is simply a high temperature. A temperature so high that there's a heat wave that kills large numbers of people. And the heat waves will be at much higher temperatures. They will last much longer. And they are close now to making life unlivable in some important parts of the world that are full of people, like southern Iran, like southern Iraq, like the Gulf. They will, but that will be a much more general problem. And the fact that a heat wave in 1995 killed 1,000 people in Chicago, we'll be looking at heat waves that kill 10,000 and 20,000 people in Chicago, which is a cold place. And they will be much worse in the hot places in the world. The third thing that will happen that's important is sea level rise is a bit important, but the really important thing is storms. Tropical storms are now spreading so that they're more because the sea is hotter, they're more intense, the tropical storms, but they're also spreading north in the northern hemisphere and south in the southern hemisphere. They will continue to spread and increase, and the point of that is how they combine. A massive tropical storm combines with rising sea level to produce the things that in the United States you saw with Hurricane Sandy or with Hurricane Katrina, but that you will see on a much worse scale. And what it means is that so many people live and have their wealth and their houses and their lives invested in big cities on the seacoast, that the destruction of New York and Shanghai and Karachi and Mumbai and the Mekong Delta in Vietnam and so on, the flooding of these places will be rendered unlivable. That will again have serious consequences, and there will be the economic consequences. In this process, an enormous amount of value will be lost, an enormous amount of production networks will be severed. We have seen on a very small scale, with what's relatively the small scale global environmental disaster that we have seen with COVID, which is relatively very small, right? Not to insult the people who are mourning people, as so many of us are, but compared to what's coming with climate change, a very small scale, we've seen the economic dislocation. And what will happen when very large centers of wealth are destroyed, what will happen in the fighting between the owners of wealth, and the unemployment and the privation it will bring to the rest of us. I think COVID has finally made me realize how important that will be. More important than that, though, will be the refugees. We're already seeing climate refugees in many places in the world, but we will see, once we start to hit the state of cascading feedbacks, we'll see hundreds of millions, maybe at least hundreds of millions of climate refugees. And those people will come up against borders that are patrolled by men and women with machine guns. They will be housed in refugee camps in tents that stretch for miles and miles and will last for decades, the people living in them. And past a certain point, the people who have to live in those camps will not be properly fed. And on the other side of the border, there will be a massive increase in racism to justify keeping all of those desperate people on the other side of the wall. Some of those racisms will be, and those will be racisms, of course, against the people inside on our wall who are like the people who are outside the wall. And some of those will be racisms we are very familiar with, and some of them will be entirely new racisms because new people will be entering into this state of horror. And then there will be war. Change the balance of geographic power. And all the major powers and the small powers will rush in to try and change it back to their advantage. And none of these things will happen ever just as a result of climate change. All of them will happen with all of the turmoil and inequality and cruelty that are already produced by the capitalist system we live in. They will be, and these will be, if you want to see what that looks like, look at the history of Darfur and Chad in Africa. Since in 1968, the rains failed in Darfur and Chad because of climate change for the first time. And there have been periodic droughts and famines, worse and worse, coming and going since 1968. And people tried to hold it together for a very long time, and then they started killing each other. And there are many different other things that are wrapped up, many different things about oil and great power competition and so on that go on with what's happening in Darfur and Chad. But at the center of it, the center of that one, is shepherds and poor farmers killing each other for grass and for water. That will be quite general. There will be many wars with climate change. But also, this is perhaps most important, it's not going to be like you see in Hollywood. It's not going to be like people imagine widespread climate change will be. It's not going to be a bunch of isolated little group bands of people in a post-apocalyptic world walking down the roads together, in terror of their neighbors and the hairy bikers. It's not going to be like that. It's not going to be the collapse of society. It's going to be the intensification of the societies we live in. As the people who rule the world become more and more discredited by their failure to cope with this, as the conditions of people's lives get worse and worse. Let me see, I'm doing for time. Okay. As that gets worse and worse, the people who run society, they will come in with what look like solutions. The tanks will hit the streets. They will propose dictatorships. They will tell us that we all have consumed too much and that we have to consume much less. The arguments that they make will sound like the deep green arguments that are being made now. And they will tell us that we have to give up consumption, and we will give up consumption, and they will not. It will be an increasingly unequal world, a world of great suffering. And for the great suffering to be possible, there will have to be great repression, great violence, great cruelty to justify the increasing power of the state and the inequality. And my worry when I think about that, it might happen in 10 years. I think that's probably a bit fast. Certainly happened within 40 years. My worries when I think about the people I know and the people whose children I know who are going to have to live through that time, the people I love who will live through that time, is not that they are going to be, that things are going to be, that they're going to die. Hundreds of millions of people are going to die. I don't know how many, maybe 500 million, but who knows? Something infinitely worse than the worst horrors of the 20th century is going to happen. But what I worry about is what my grandchildren and all those other people, what they're going to have to see, what they're going to have to do to survive, what they're going to have to compromise with, and the kind of human society that will be created by the people who support the torturers, the people who help the torturers, the people who shoot the refugees. That's what I worry about most. Okay, that's what faces us if we don't stop climate change. To stop climate change, we have to stop the increase in greenhouse gases. I go through all the details of all the greenhouse gases in my book, but I want to concentrate on CO2 because it's almost 3/4 of the greenhouse gases. CO2 from burning oil, burning coal, and burning natural gas. We have to stop that. And people think of that as due to some immemorial kind of dirty capitalism of an old-fashioned kind. 1/2 of the total emissions that have powered global warming, 1/2 of them have been put in the air since 1985. 1/4 of the total emissions have been put in the air since 2005. And the more that the UN and the more that the world leaders have talked about stopping climate change, the more the emissions have risen. They're having a COP meeting in Glasgow in November in 2022. The emissions will be higher than they are in 2021. They talk about reducing. Actually, the global emissions keep increasing. And the speed at which they're increasing keeps increasing. And what Greta Thunberg has said is right. All of the leaders of the world, all of them, have betrayed us. All of them are lying to us. And this means that we have to build globally a movement from below. The scale of what we have to do is so big that we have to build a mass movement to do it. And I was going to talk at some length about AIDS, but I'll talk very quickly about AIDS because what I learned in the AIDS epidemic is incredibly relevant here. What I learned was I spent 6 years of my life in Britain, where I live, working as an HIV and AIDS counselor with people having tests and people who were sick. And I watched the politics of AIDS. This was in a time of great grief because the drugs that we have now, we did not have.
Jonathan, you're at 15 minutes.
Okay. And so it was a time of great grief. And going into it, political people thought that the political question was going to be, what does this mean for homophobia? What does this mean for gay culture? What does this mean for minority rights? How do we defend gay people, or how do we defend drug users? We thought those were going to be the issues, and they weren't. We discovered that mass movements, really big mass movements, were built on the issue of what do most human beings who are facing this tragedy need. And in response to that, we got first a mass movement, basically from gay men in the United States, for safe sex. They solved in one way the problem of how to stop transmission. That was the first thing. We need to stop people getting this. And so some gay men reached back into the tradition of gay celebration of men having sex with men. You could do gay sex was about doing anything you wanted and glorying in it, but using a condom because of the science to stop it spreading. That was the first thing. That was a mass movement from below, with most of the heroes are nameless. The second thing was ACT UP in New York. Again, a global problem, but mainly in New York, quite a narrow place. And that was focused, again, mobilized enormous energy among people who had HIV, or people who loved people who had HIV, who wanted to solve the problem. How do you get drugs? How do you get a cure? How can we make the system give us a cure? What do we have to organize to do? And they did that. They won that. And then the most important movement of all was a movement in South Africa, because the movements in the United States, they could win drugs for most people, not all people, in the United States, but in the places where many more people had HIV, in the poor countries of Africa and other places, they were left to die, because of course everybody understood that the drugs were too expensive, and expensive drugs couldn't be given to people in poor countries. Of course not. Everybody knew that was a fact of life. And that remained a fact of life until a small number of gay revolutionary socialists in South Africa, led by a gay revolutionary socialist of color who had been sent to jail under apartheid for burning his high school down, they set out to create a mass movement to win the HIV drugs for people in South Africa. And they mostly gay men with university degrees, they created a mass movement that was overwhelmingly Black working class women, who shamed and embarrassed and demonstrated and sat in and forced the American government, who was trying to prevent them getting drugs, the South African government, who was trying to prevent them getting drugs, it forced all the powers in the world to give them the drugs at prices people could afford. Okay, what I learned from that is, what's the socialist approach to a terrible tragedy? Socialist approach to terrible tragedy is to figure out what it is that human beings need to avoid dying, and help each other to put through the policies that will get that. Okay, what that means, for in this situation is that in order to reduce we have to reduce carbon dioxide emissions globally by about 90%. That means we have to reduce carbon dioxide emissions in the richer countries in the world by about 95%, and in most of the poorer countries in the world, like China and India, by between 80 and 90%. It means absolutely massive reductions. There is no way that we are going to have reductions on that scale by people consuming less. 95% cuts in the standard of living in the United States, 90% cuts in the standard of living in China. Those are out of the question. The people accept that. What it means is we have to use a different kind of energy. And what it means is we'll need a lot of jobs to do that. We need to cover the world with renewable energy, mainly wind turbines and solar panels, but many other kinds of renewable energy. We need to cover the world with that, so that all of the electricity that is produced by renewable energy. We need great, big, smart grids to connect up all that renewable energy. We need, for transport, we need to change almost all transport so that it is powered by electricity. Get people out of planes and into trains that are powered by electricity. Get many more people on public transport so that we need less electricity. All that electricity from renewable energy. For industry, we need to shut down cement and concrete completely. And for the other necessary industrial products, we need all of the heating of materials to be done with electricity that is produced by renewable energy. For heating and cooling of houses, we need massive insulation, and again, all done with renewable energy. Those are the central things we need to do. That require, I mean, there are many, many more jobs that need to be done. I go through an enormous variety of them in the book, but that's the most important set. There is no force on earth that can do this other than governments. Governments can afford to do it. It costs less to do it in the United States each year, a good deal less than the Trump administration spent on COVID. The money is there. We saw with COVID that the money is there. It is available. But it needs to be, it's not going to be spent by anybody else but governments. That means we need mass movements that can force governments to do this. And that can either change the people that the parties put in government, or change the parties, or change the system, but one way and another, get people running the state who are actually prepared to do this and are going to do it. There are many, many different technical arguments I go through in the book about how you do this, and about batteries, lithium batteries, and the emissions from cows, digestive system, and many, many others. And you do have to go through all of them. But at the center, if you read through the book, at the center of an enormous number of arguments is some people are putting an argument that says we don't really need to change all of the energy. There is something else that we need to do, or we can do something else, or we can't do changing all of the energy. These technical arguments boil down to, are we going to do this? The whole thing boils down to, are we going to do this? Now, because what we face in trying to do it, what we face in organizing, is first of all, we face climate denial by the big power, by the oil companies and the coal companies and the power companies and so on. They're basically into climate denial. Much more important is that the ruling class on this issue is actually deeply split. And they're split because they own the world. They have descendants. They do not want to destroy the world, and they understand the same science we understand. But if they're going to solve this problem, it would let loose the floodgates of human need that have been held back by capitalism, by austerity, by neoliberalism. Everybody would say, well, if we can do that to save the climate, to save all living things, if we can do that for that, why not my job? Why don't I have a home? What about my pension? What about my school? What about the hospital? People would say all of those things. So all of the apparatus of austerity that we have confronted for so long would be blown away, and so would the very crucial idea that you can't change things, that you really can't fight City Hall. That's been the greatest achievement of neoliberalism, is even in the heads of the opposition, of the mass movements of the left, of people like us, there is this desperate feeling that you can't actually fight and change the system. If we can do it with climate change, we can blow that away across the board. And that's why everybody from the Barack Obamas to the Bidens and so on, and the Merkels and all the rest, they want to do something. They genuinely want to do something, but then they draw back at the scale of what has to be done.
Jonathan, about
yes.
5 minutes left.
5 minutes. Okay. And this is where I want to come to the importance of people like us on this call, to the importance of socialists and trade unionists. We haven't led the movement about climate change, people like us. The people who told the world about climate change and persuaded everybody that it was a really serious problem and that something ought to be done, whether or not something ought to be done, those were the scientists and the environmentalists, the Greens. They are the people who publicize this issue because it was their issue. The environment's not an old trade union or socialist issue. And they were a big enough movement to tell all the world. They're not a big enough social force to win the kind of fight we need to win. For that, we have to have the working class is a jargon word. We have to have the working people, most of the working people of the world. And we have to have the small farmers of the world. We have to have those people, not just on side, but as the central force pushing for change. And also the solutions to climate. We didn't see the problem coming. So we're not central to the people talking about the solutions yet, although we're starting to be. But we can, the whole trade union socialist tradition, we can see the solution. The solution is we need to act collectively, and we need governments to do it to meet human need. And we need to change whatever there is in society that stops us from meeting the human need. That's where we come in. And that's in the last 5 years, there's been an enormous shift. You can argue about whether Ocasio-Cortez is really a socialist or not, but she says she is. And the ideas behind the Green New Deal are ideas about government spending enormous amounts of money to meet human need and the needs of all other living things. And we've seen a change in the method. Very crucially important, the climate strikes by school students have been more important than anything else. And that's because they're strikes. They are strikes at school, but the climate movement has moved from trying to persuade a minority that this is good to persuading a majority. Those school kids have to persuade the other kids at school to do it. It's a quantum leap in the method to the method that is traditionally at the heart of working class struggle. Now, 2 or 3 things. What do you do? I don't want to say that only one method works. Anybody who tells you there's one thing you have to do about climate change is trying to sell you the Brooklyn Bridge. There are many, many, many different things. One absolutely not to be underestimated is the importance of talking to people. Just conversations. There has been a world shift in how people feel about climate change, and this is accelerating in pace, and it's the result, above all, of an enormous number of conversations. We're entering into a struggle. The methods that we're going into the struggle with now are not the methods we're going to be using by the time we're winning. The arguments that we're having are not the arguments we're going to have when we get there. The coalitions that we have are not the coalitions that we're going to have when we get there. All of this is going to change under the enormous pressure of events and the enormous pressure of the increasing impact of climate change. So we're starting, every great social movement throws up entirely new methods of struggle and entirely new visions of an alternative. That's not entirely new visions that build on it, but entirely new methods of struggle. We have to be prepared for those going in, and that the first point is to try and to realize the absolute crucial importance of people like us. But I want to end with one more thing. Every step of the way, there's a contradiction people like you and I have to wrestle with, but many, many more people are quite unlike us are wrestling with it now too. Many more people than us. And it's what we need to do. We need to change the world. To do this, you can have an argument about whether or not it's going to take a revolution, but we're going to have to change the world. And what we want to do is very, very radical in terms of how the world is organized now. That's one half of the contradiction. The other half of the contradiction is we're going to need, because we're up against all the powers of the world, we're going to need enormous popular support. in American terms, we're going to need not just the people who voted for Joe Biden in the primaries. We're going to need an awful lot of people who voted for Trump. We're going to need to construct a truly mass movement, and a mass movement rooted in ordinary people, which is to say working class people. And so we want a movement for a very, very radical goal that brings together an enormous variety of people who at the moment, many of them aren't thinking of our solutions at all, and many of them aren't thinking of looking for a solution. So always the wrong answer to this real contradiction is to compromise and compromise and compromise and just slice off everything you're proposing until you can get to 51% support right now for whatever it is you're proposing. That's the wrong answer, because that will never solve the problem, because nature does not negotiate in that way. And we're looking at a natural progress we're pushing along. So what you have to do is you have to talk very clearly to people and very honestly, and always with mutual respect, always with the idea that their friends and neighbors and the people they know in trade unions and so on are going to bring them closer to our position, that experience is going to bring them closer to our position, that the experience of climate change is going to transform them, but you have to deal with people with respect and love without compromising what you're saying about what has to be done. And that's often very difficult. But the last thing to say, and this is important, is I think it's possible to be too downhearted about what can be done. I've been doing this kind of organizing for 17 years now, and I'm more hopeful than I've been at any point. For the first 12, 15 to 13 years, I was pretty sure that we were going to fail, that we were going to hell before we collectively dealt with this. Now, the idea is spreading. The fact that we're arguing about climate jobs and a Green New Deal, massive government spending to provide people with jobs who need jobs, this was a tiny niche idea in the environmental movement, much less in the wider world. In 10 years ago, it's now pretty much accepted through the trade union movement over much of the world. In one form or another, people know that this is what we have to do. If you watch I went and looked at the signs in this student strikes in different parts of the world on the internet, and there again and again were the signs for climate jobs. The signs, there are no jobs in the dead planet. Many different parts of the world in many different languages, people are picking up these ideas because they're making sense. And people, particularly what the climate strikers represent, is a new, far more radical generation in almost all over the world on almost all issues. The people who are 30 are much more radical than the people who are over 30. And the people who are under 18 are much more radical than the people who are over 18. The idea is spreading. The movement is spreading. It's a race against time. But we're in with a chance. And this is the last point. Socialists, what we're for.
Jonathan, I'm wondering, in the interest of time, you'll have some time to come back at the end, but I think we want to move on soon.
Okay, I'll stop right there.
Okay, you'll have some time in the last section to
Yeah.
do any wrap up and reflection that you want to do.
Sure.
So, okay, thank you so much.
Thank you.
That was really a helpful kickoff to our discussion. For those of you who got on a little late, we have about 55 more minutes left here. We're going to do some smaller breakout groups for 20 minutes to kind of kick off the discussion, and then come back together for 25 minutes to wrap things up. And as part of that, we put together a couple of prompt questions, some compound prompt questions, which I'll put in the chat right now. What do you see as the main problem with the perspective Jonathan is outlining? Or / what do you see as the main strength of that perspective? And then second, what would we need to make it possible to build a movement that can actually stop emissions globally in the short term and in the long term? And I noticed there's a lot of stuff in the chat, which I didn't have time to follow, or I was paying attention to Jonathan, but we kind of want to hopefully focus on a couple of things so we can have a complete discussion of those. And I think some of the things in the chat can come into to those questions. So I'm going to turn it over to Thomas now, who's going to do the breakouts, and we'll see everyone back in about 25 minutes.
Okay, everyone, I'm about to send you into the breakout room. So see you in 20 minutes.
Or 20 minutes, yep.